into Afghanistan.
Between 1865 and 1872, the War Department's Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, or the Freedmen's Bureau, provided help to tens of thousands of former slaves. Next on American History TV, National Park Service Ranger Emmanuel Dabney discusses the extensive archival records of the Freedmen's Bureau and what they can tell us about the lives of former slaves. Dabney describes how the Bureau issued food and clothing, operated hospitals and temporary camps, helped locate lost family members, and provided education and legal services. This hour-long talk is hosted by the Emerging Civil War blog.
To wrap up our sequence of morning speakers, it's my privilege to welcome back Emmanuel Dabney. Emmanuel joined us last night as part of the panel. He comes to us from south of the James, so this I-95 traffic that many of you had the joy of experiencing, he has also had the joy to experience today. I think he's eager to go back south of the James. Emmanuel grew up in Dinwiddie County, and so Petersburg was home to him. The story very closely connected to his own personal story, both as a child and through his ancestry. And so he began volunteering eventually at Petersburg National Battlefield, where he then became a seasonal, worked there for a number of years, and then became a permanent historian down there. He has been there now 14 years, sharing the story that is largely overforgotten. Yet the armies are in one spot there longer than they are anywhere else. And the stories of the people affected by the presence of those armies has gone untold. But fortunately, Emmanuel has brought that story to the forefront. He's here today to talk to us about one of the other enduring legacies of the war, that of the Freedmen's Bureau. The great question, even during the war, was what's going to happen with all of these emancipated slaves? The Freedmen's Bureau was an attempt to answer that. And as Emmanuel will discuss with us, is a very complicated answer. Emmanuel Dabney, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah, I'm not sure how people deal with this traffic on the north side of Richmond. It seems like just now, whenever you leave Richmond, you better plan on a year to get to what it normally takes 10 minutes to get to. So I am certainly happy that I made it. I was a little worried this morning I may not get here, and looking forward to our question and answer period to tackle the subject of the Freedmen's Bureau. On November 3, 1865, Captain Stuart Barnes, the superintendent of the 2nd District of the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, headquartered in Petersburg, Virginia, issued a circular which highlights the challenges that face the Bureau in the post-war years. Barnes wrote, "Assistant superintendents will act at once, commence a tour of their respective counties, visit the different plantations, and make themselves acquainted with the working of the new system of free labor. Disabuse the minds of the freedmen of the many extravagant ideas and wrong impressions prevailing among them as to their status as freedmen, to wit, that the government is to give them land, that the plantations and property of their former masters is to be divided among them, that if they remain in their old homes, they are not free, or if they hire themselves for another year, in implied servitude for 5 years, or that the government will feed them in idleness. By careful, plain advice, endeavor to remove any prejudices or lack of confidence that may exist between the two classes. Assure them that the government will protect them in person and property and all their rights and privileges, but that they alone are responsible for the maintenance of themselves and families. Urge them all to make contracts at once for another year, either for wages or a share in the crops, and be prepared to ratify such contracts on the spot. Explain to them the disturbed and desolated state of the country, and that generally they can do better to remain on the old plantations than to wander about looking for a more lucrative situation. This work must be prosecuted with vigor, reporting from time to time the general condition of affairs to this office. During the absence of assistant superintendents, the board organized under recent orders will adjudicate in all cases that may arise and have the care of the office duties. Here we go. The Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, shortened typically to just the Freedmen's Bureau, had quite a huge task if you just listen to every word that the superintendent has issued from the Petersburg office. That task best summarized by historian Eric Foner. The organization had to introduce the free labor system to the South, work with northern benevolent organizations to create an education system for blacks, provide aid to the destitute, elderly, infirm, ill, and mentally ill, be a court system to settle disputes between blacks and whites, try to ensure equal justice for blacks and white unionists, serve as a marriage counselor, mediate and review labor contracts, and somehow win confidence between the two races. This image here coming from the Harper's Weekly shows a single officer in the midst of all of this sort of mob chaos from both white and black Southerners. The Bureau was created March 3, 1865. On the exact same day, the Freedmen Saving and Trust Company was created as a bank to encourage former slaves to save money. As the longer name implies, the Bureau was not only to deal with issues related to freedmen, but also white Unionist refugees and any abandoned or confiscated lands. The lands were to be divided into 40-acre lots, and freedmen or white loyal refugees could rent them until they were sold as best as the United States could sell land that technically was not the government's. However, during the second half of 1865, President Andrew Johnson restored most of the property of almost all former Confederates. Despite attempts to counter this political maneuver by a special order from the head of the Bureau, President Johnson's ideology won out, and thus almost all of the 850,000 acres in the control of the Bureau in June of 1865 have been restored to their pre-war owners by December of 1865. And so the long-discussed 40 acres and a mule disappeared in a matter of 6 months. John Wilkes Booth not only killed President Abraham Lincoln, but created an enemy of the Freedmen's Bureau that appeared in the form of the man on this slide, Andrew Johnson. In February of 1866, he vetoed Congress's Freedmen's Bureau bill, which Congress failed to override. On July 3, 1866, both houses of the Congress passed another Freedmen's Bureau bill, which Johnson vetoed on the 16th of July of 1866. This time, Congress did override his veto. Johnson's opposition to the bill was based on his own racial prejudices, and formally he opposed the use of military during peacetime. He felt the bill was a federal encroachment into state matters. Johnson believed the bill would prevent former slaves from being self-sufficient and that there was nothing for poor whites. Finally, he opposed the bill because he believed that Congress should not make decisions for states without representation in the federal Congress, and that opposition over this subject and many others, as many folks know, will have him in a battle royale with Congress over the course of his term in office. And you can see Johnson here in this image kicking the Freedmen's Bureau bill away in his disdain. The Freedmen's Bureau was headed by Major General Oliver Otis Howard, who had lost his right arm in battle in June of 1862. Howard is known amongst many certainly in the black community, for working with others to organize a university that carries his name still in Washington, D.C. In 1867, and for which he was the president of that university from 1869 to 1874. In different districts and sub-districts throughout the South, agents, generally former Army officers, served as superintendents and assistant superintendents. Despite the memories of white Southerners that Phil just mentioned a few moments ago, there were few to no federal troops in most of the South during the period of Reconstruction. That's a problem if you're looking for help from the Freedmen's Bureau, because who's going to be there to enforce whatever regulations that they may come out with and the laws as they are being applied to the now defeated former Confederate states. The recently freed people became politically motivated even in the midst of other crises facing them. Virginia needed a new constitution to be readmitted to the Union as parameters of the government's Reconstruction plan. At the end of May 1867, Lieutenant C.M. Dougal wrote to his superior about the condition of the freedmen for the counties of Wythe, Bland, Tazewell, Smith, Carroll, and Grayson. Those are counties in southwest Virginia. He noted in part that complaints are frequently made at my office of threats being made to intimidate freedmen and to compel them to support men in the approaching election of delegates for the convention to make a constitution for the state, who are not acceptable to the colored people, neither to the true Union men of this district. In all such cases, we have assured the colored people that they would be protected in the free exercise of all their rights. A few months later, Captain William Austin wrote a letter regarding the political activity of blacks in southwest Virginia. Political clubs called Union Leagues have been formed in nearly all the counties. Through the influence of these clubs, the majority of the freedmen have been reached and instructed in their rights and the issues and the decision of which they will have a voice. They have learned not to fear to meet and interchange their views and assert what they believe are their rights. They feel as long as they behave peaceably, they have the protection of the government. So far as I am aware, they have always conducted themselves quietly and will in their meetings. Yet the political activism of blacks would not serve them well with most white Virginians. Captain Austin, writing again from this corner of Virginia about blacks being discharged from employment for supporting Republicans. In May 1867, Lieutenant Hector Sears reported that the feeling between the whites and blacks is apparently good, but in reality it is bad. The whites do not want the blacks to vote unless they vote as the whites tell them, and they do not want them to hold meetings to instruct their color in regard to registration and voting. In my own county of Dinwiddie, southern part of the state, in November of 1867, the Bureau agent reported that 5 whites had dismissed 5 black laborers for voting the Republican ticket. He also said that numerous others rumored to be discharged but have not as yet learned their names. And so here you see this struggle, in this case not really represented much as a struggle, with this sort of elderly black man voting, something that he never thought he would probably do. You have sort of the next generation in the New South, a former Union black soldier who's voting. Of course, what the Harper's Weekly did not illustrate was all of the sort of back and forth that those Bureau agents were discussing in their reports. The Bureau also involved itself with the family affairs of the recently freed. One of its greatest achievements was documenting the marriages of the former slaves. On February 27, 1866, the Virginia General Assembly enacted a law which made such that former slaves who had married during slavery would be entitled to the rights and privileges of a married couple, and that their children were deemed legitimate. The Freedmen's Bureau's assistant superintendents created a register of colored persons cohabitating together as husband and wife on 27 February 1866 to document these couples and their children, and they were left with clerks of court in the counties of the state or retained in the Freedmen's Bureau's records. The surviving Virginia cohabitation registers exist for the following counties: Augusta, Caroline, Culpeper, Floyd, Fluvanna, Goochland, Hanover, Lunenburg, Montgomery, Prince Edward, Richmond County, not the city, Roanoke County, Scott, Smith, Surrey, Warren, Washington, and Wythe, and they can be accessed through the Library of Virginia's website of Virginia Memory. These records contain the name of the husband and wife, their ages, place of birth, residence, occupation, last owner's city or county of residence, the names of children with the ages of each, and the date of commencement of cohabitation. They are extremely important records for black Virginians who are trying to document their family's history. Some of you may know we sort of typically hit what we call the 1870 brick wall, where it is difficult to get past that because previous census data did not list individual names of enslaved people, and most people in the South, certainly here in Virginia, who were black, were enslaved. One of the more interesting of these cohabitation records that I looked at came from the Caroline County Register, which included the notation of two old people, and I say that because they literally, truly are old. John Baptist and his wife, Lily Timlick, were both 89 years old. They had been owned by Joseph Chandler of Caroline County. They claimed to have been a couple since 1791. They would have been 14 years old at the time. And whether that's true or not, we can't say for sure, but they did have 3 surviving daughters: Ellen, age 49, Judy, 47, and Agnes, 45. It's clear that this couple have been committed to each other for potentially more than 7 decades before anyone legally recognized their marriage. So all the time people ask me, were slaves married? Yes, they recognized their marriage. I'm sure Joseph Chandler even recognized their marriage. But the state of Virginia did not. This particular register made it possible for it to be. The Bureau also attempted to aid blacks in locating family members. Thomas P. Jackson, the agent in Stanton, related to his superior in July 1867 that Patience Spencer had come to him wishing to locate her 15-year-old son, James Thomas, and 11-year-old daughter, Melissa Ann Maria Spencer. She and the children had hid out in the woods in the summer of 1861 to escape sale, but hunger compelled her to let her children return to the house for food when they were seized and carried off. At that time, they were taken by John Mitchell of Lynchburg and sold in Richmond, but she was never able to find out to whom they had been sold. Jackson, like Patience Spencer, hoped that the 2 men she thought may know something would be able to provide details. But a note on the form found that by August 20th, 1867, neither John Mitchell, who had sold them, or another man Patience mentioned, knew what became of her children. At the end of the Civil War, Margaret Ann Bird was emancipated and destitute. She was also in distress. In mid-October 1865, she sought the attention of R.P. Clayton, superintendent of the Bureau located at City Point, modern Hopewell, Virginia. The year of 1862 had likely been the worst year of her life, for her owner sold her that year from Wood Hollow in Clay County, North Carolina, to Petersburg, Virginia. She was the mother of 4 children. Clayton wrote to his superior to try to find her transportation to be relocated with her children. Numerous assistant superintendents of the Bureau dealt with making family members take care of their spouse or children, or ruling on matters of the behavior of freed people. Illiterate freedman Napoleon Turpin wrote to Lieutenant H.S. Merrill that his sister had died after having a baby. His sister had 4 children ranging in age from 8 days old at the time of his writing the letter to 9 years old. Napoleon informed Merrill that his brother-in-law had deserted the family and refused to take care of his wife and their children. Turpin sought the Bureau's assistance to make his sister's husband care for the burial expenses and to see to his children's financial well-being. Apprenticeships forced upon black children, who were often considered orphans because of a lack of a father, even though the mother was alive and well, created another task for the Bureau. In Alexandria, the agent wrote that if black children had to be removed from apprenticeships, quote, by force or even bloodshed, let it be done. The purpose of the Bureau must and shall be carried out. Yet at the same time, the Bureau endorsed apprenticeships when they were unsure if the parent or parents could support their children. Such as the agent in Lynchburg, the officials were, quote, ordered to bind out the child in any case where the parents received government support. For those parents who were unhappy with each other, they looked to the Bureau to assist them as well. Mary Winder of Yorktown turned to the Freedmen's Court to keep her children in her care. The father, John Burbridge, to whom she wasn't married to and hadn't been when they had their 2 children, wanted to keep the children to secure an indenture for them. He said he offered to take her back since the war, but she refused to live with me. Mary fought back, exclaiming that John never done anything for me. She went on, I could not live with him as he was always drunken and worthless. She went on to say that he had done nothing for the children, that they had went their separate ways, and that the children are all the support I have. I have worked hard to raise these children. I do not know what would become of me if they were taken away from me. And the court affirmed that Mary Winder would retain custody of the children and that their father has no claim to them whatever. In another case in Stanton, Thomas Jackson wrote to his superior in Winchester on behalf of David or Daniel Collins regarding his wife Hannah, who had left to visit her mother in Winchester in September 1867. But in August of 1868, she's still not home. Jackson received a reply that Hannah Collins had become the wife of a different man in Winchester. Collins wanted to know what he could do to be free of his polygamous wife. Jackson asked the superior if he could simply strike their marriage from the register, stating that what had happened, or if Collins needed to go to court to apply for divorce. Jackson noted that Collins's means are limited for divorce. And the superior responded to his subordinate that Collins would still legally be married unless he filed a divorce in court. So we have this great image here of some people getting married. For some folks, that was what they really wanted. Obviously, for other folks, they were looking to be done with their lives from the past. Education was one area that General Howard and black Southerners were aligned as a means to secure freedom. Regrettably, due to the lack of sufficient funding, the Bureau had to work with Northern aid organizations to get their schools off the ground. It was practically impossible to assist poor whites with education, as noted in the beginning of 1868 by Captain William Austin in Southwest Virginia. He wrote that whites were opposed to educating freedmen and poor whites. He went on to say that poor whites are in as bad or worse condition than the freedmen. He reported that they refused to go to school with blacks and that The sentiments of both colors are such that mixed schools are not practicable. And of course, that would have to wait another 100 years, basically, for integration to come to Virginia. And of course, for some people, not come willingly. Learning was challenging, as reported by former U.S. Colored Troop officer Henry G. Thomas, who commanded the Southwest Virginia Subdistrict at the beginning of 1869, when he responded to a questionnaire. What is the public sentiment as to the education of freedmen and poor whites? Thomas wrote, adverse, but not actively so as a rule. In the more barbarous parts of my district, such as Wytheville, Christiansburg, and Marion, the feeling finds itself in outlets of lies and slurs on the school teachers, and at Christiansburg in filthy jokes, not original, as published by the rebel orangutan in the Marion Star, a newspaper. Small slips of paper by attempted, unsuccessful, to tear down a schoolhouse and flog the bureau officer at Wytheville. He thought the schools there would need another decade of support from Northern aid organizations. Lieutenant Hector Sears, the assistant superintendent in the subdistrict of Stafford, reported in March 1866 that white people there were very much opposed to the education of the Negroes. Very few will have colored children bound to them because they are obliged to educate them. Still, schools sprang up. In January 1866, the Manassas School was supported by the Society of Friends of Philadelphia. Mary K. Perry was the teacher at Manassas by 1868 and had 32 students attending the school. In Christiansburg, out in southwest Virginia, a black woman who was free before the war moved out of her own house in order to allow black pupils to have somewhere to go. And a few of the better-known whites in the town supported the school, including a Mr. James Taylor, who loaned the school benches, and a Mr. Thomas Wilson, who loaned a table and chairs. In Dinwiddie County, by February 1867, freedmen were building a school, and the assistant superintendent noted to his superior that the freedmen are very anxious to have a teacher, and children will come to make a large school. And I respectfully request that a teacher may be assigned to this place with as little delay as possible. In Yorktown, the Teacher's Monthly School Report for January 1867 shows that a school opened in November of 1866 thanks to the assistance of the Friends Freedmen Association in Philadelphia. There was one white teacher, Hannah Cox, 40 male students, 25 female students. 12 of the students were over the age of 16, and 20 of them could spell and read easy lessons. Of course, you know, teaching slaves was illegal in antebellum and wartime Virginia, yet there is some clandestine network of people who are instructing. And 45 of these students were listed as advanced readers. All 65 students were being instructed in writing, and there were 3 grades. None of these students were free before the Civil War. Just 1 month later, the same Yorktown school, the population of students had exploded. There were now 4 white teachers, 261 male students, and 321 female students. Similar tales emerged from Leesburg, where on September 30th, 1866, the assistant superintendent of that district stated that there were 3 free schools supported by Northern benevolent organizations and a private school taught by an educated and intelligent colored man. The Bureau was also busy mediating labor contracts and disputes. Contracts were viewed by the Bureau as being the only thing to ensure blacks were being treated fairly and that whites would have a feeling of comfort that they would have labor from an individual. Some contracts were very detailed, like the one between Freedman Nelson Walker and Samuel Husher, the steward of the Western Lunatic Asylum in Stanton. And that's what it was called in the 1860s. Walker was to be paid $120 1 year for working at the institution. The payments would be given $10 per month, and the steward would also provide proper and suitable food and quarters, furnish medical attention and medicine free of charge, except in case of midwifery, which I'm not really sure why a man would need that, but anyway, surgery, or when the sickness is protracted beyond 3 weeks continuance. $10 was to be withheld until the end of the year, when deductions were to be made from any lost time. Whomever violated the contract would have to pay the other person $20. Other contracts, not so detailed, such as the one between a white cousin of mine and his employee, Shadrach Alphin. The white employer agreed to give Shadrach Alphin 1/2 of all the tobacco and also 1/2 of all the corn he makes over 40 barrels. The said Boysaw, Benjamin Hatcher Boysaw was his name, to find him and family, also to clothe his children. The said Shadrach is to work as I say, I find team, etc. That was the end of that particular contract. A conflict was bound to occur, such as in Buckingham County, where the Freedmen's Bureau Court heard a case regarding the 1865 winter wheat harvest. There were 3 men who planted the wheat crop as slaves, but by the time of the harvest they were working under contract for their former owner for 1/3 of the crop. The former owner did not want to pay the crop amount because the 3 men had been enslaved when they planted it. The Bureau Court ruled in favor of the 3 employees. However, one of the men, Joe Cooper, believed he should only have to plant and harvest the crop and nothing more, though the farm owner wanted him to do other responsibilities, and the court agreed with the landowner that he could have Joe Cooper do other tasks as assigned. Dozens of cases are going to be heard from the Freedmen's Court between freed people and their white employers. John David, a black resident, complained to the Bureau in June 1867 that his employer, Thomas Jarvins, assaulted him, beating him about the face and head because John had requested his weekly wages. In a letter to a white employer, the Bureau agent in Charlottesville noted in part that the contract that was written up for a potential employee was not a fair or just one in its provisions. The obligations are not mutual. The compensation is totally inadequate to the labor. He noted, however, he would not interfere with the contract, but if the employer violated any part of the contract, I shall cancel the contract and leave them to proceed against you for damages. This is a long or a series here of contracts that you can see that are much more detailed than just a scrap of paper that some of them were written on. The Freedmen's Bureau sub-district agents recorded an enormous amount of racial violence in their letters to their superiors, begging the question of was the war really over simply because Confederate soldiers laid down their government-issued arms. One example comes from Stanton, where in late June 1866, Madison Dooms, an employee of the Virginia Central Railroad, told a black porter at the hotel there to get off the platform and then hit the porter, Floyd Adams, with a club, knocking him down. The jury in the case said that Dooms was doing his duty to keep the platform clear of hotel porters. However, Lieutenant George Cook, the bureau agent there, wrote that it was an act of gross injustice, the jury having literally given the white man permission to knock the Negro down without fear of molestation. In Lexington, Virginia, the bureau agent in the fall of 1866 reported that a law student named J.C. Johnson mortally wounded Patrick Thompson, a freedman. They were not isolated incidents and occurred everywhere throughout the state. Bureau agent Sidney Smith reported that Charles Murray, a black man, had gone into Fauquier County in search of his son and was nearly murdered. Lieutenant W.F. DeKnight, the assistant superintendent at Lynchburg in May 1866, writing to his boss that a black man had come in while he was writing to him that had been wounded by a group of white men because he refused to play the banjo for them as he did not know how. Lieutenant Frederick Massey, the bureau head for York and James City counties in May 1866, wrote that, "Were it not for the controlling hand of the bureau and military authorities, I am satisfied that the whites would treat them in the most unfair and unjust manner." Massey noted that those whites who would treat the freed people fairly were, as he said, the exception. In reporting how blacks felt toward whites, he said that blacks were very bitter and that they were suspicious against the secesh. In early 1867, same man reported that whites in the neighboring counties to York treated blacks harshly and cruelly, noting that freed people are compelled to call their employers master and missus, that they are not paid promptly, if at all, and instead of kind and encouraging words from the whites, cuffs and oaths are meted out to them without measure. In September 1867, Captain Sidney Smith, agent at Leesburg, reported that a colored man by the name of John Taylor of this county in the vicinity of Mount Gilead was murdered on the night of the 4th instant in his own house, in the presence of his family, which consisted of his wife and 8 children. The perpetrator of this dreadful deed came to the house of Mr. Taylor in company with 2 others, all 3 of whom were disguised as colored men, faces painted, etc. After Mrs. Taylor begged for her husband's life to be spared, the men went about robbing the house of what they wanted. The one man then put his revolver to John Taylor's neck, fatally wounding him. Taylor died 2 days later, though, prior to his death, he stated that he thought Bush Underwood had committed the deed. The agent said, "There has been nothing done by the civil authorities to find out the perpetrator of this dreadful murder, notwithstanding Mr. Henson Simpson, a near neighbor of deceased, personally brought this matter to the notice of a justice of the peace by the name of Enoch Fenton and a constable, both of them having taken an official cognizance of the case. The civil authorities are only disposed to protect freedmen by bringing to justice those who have and continue to commit outrages against them." Later that month, Smith repeated his general sentiments about the local court system. "It is entirely out of question for a colored man to get justice done him by these magistrate courts where a white man is interested against him, while at the same time the magistrate is careful to connive so as not to commit himself to the liabilities of a fraudulent proceeding." On October 27, 1866, Sidney Smith, still in Leesburg, reported that on the 23rd of the month, a 13-year-old boy named William, who stated he knew no surname for himself, came to Smith and reported that he had been living with Frank Taylor of Loudon since the end of the war. Taylor had stripped William naked and tied the boy's shirt around his head and face in order to smother his cries, and beat him in such a shocking manner as to cut through the skin in several places. Smith examined William and found the marks of the whipping. William reported that he had always been used very badly by Mr. Taylor. Immediately, Smith took William to a justice of the peace in Leesburg, who said he would issue a warrant for arrest for Taylor the following morning. William ended up finding an aunt he didn't know was living and moved in with her. The aunt took her nephew to the Justice of the Peace's office the following morning, but he was out. She found another justice and applied for a warrant to be taken out against Taylor, but this other justice said he had more important things to do. In the meanwhile, Smith had gone to the office of the initial Justice of the Peace, who told him that Taylor had went to see the aunt of William and settled the matter, and that the aunt was opting not to pursue charges. Smith went to the aunt, who said she had entered no such agreement with Taylor. Smith returned to the Justice of the Peace and demanded a warrant to be issued. The justice said he would as soon as William appeared at his office. But after William arrived, the Justice of the Peace refused to do so because he was sticking to his tale about the aunt having agreed not to pursue charges against Taylor. Despite Smith's efforts, he noted, up to the present time, has not been issued, and that there is no probability that any action will be taken by the civil authorities in the case. It's a lot of work. It's one person. Smith has lots of people in Northern Virginia that he's dealing with. The infamous Ku Klux Klan that you see here was involved with creating concern in Stanton's black community by early May 1868. The agent reported, "This Klan made their appearance in the streets of Stanton about 1 o'clock Sunday morning last, mounted, and the Klan being in mass in white sheets or something of the kind and being armed caused no little consternation among the colored people and much serious annoyance to the respectable whites. Their operations were attended with the discharge of pistols and also by cheers or yelling, which of course occurring as it did almost in the center of town, aroused almost the entire population. The colored people are very much excited upon the subject, and but little is needed to bring about a serious state of things here. I would also remark that I have reported the facts to the military commissioner for this district also, John W. Jordan." The last thing I'll discuss before we move on to question and answer is the Bureau's role in public welfare for the destitute, infirm, elderly, orphans, those that were considered insane, as they would have called them, and sick. This subject was perhaps the most divisive in the white North with President Andrew Johnson and within Congress. Part of this divisiveness centers on the ideology of free labor within the Republican Party of the mid-1800s. There would be a great amount of welfare provided in Virginia. Between November 1865 and September 1866, Virginia Freedmen's Bureau provided relief for thousands of freedmen, women, and children. Yet the number of people receiving relief consistently decreased. In November 1865, more than 6,000 children, more than 3,500 women, and about 1,500 men received help. Yet by June of the next year, only 1,000 men are receiving help, 2,000 women, and a little over 2,500 children. There's a lot of information about the distribution of rations for freedmen and white Unionist refugees in the surviving records for Virginia. But we don't know as much about clothing. And the only area of the state that I could find any information about clothing came from Southwest Virginia, which is sort of strange. Many of you may know, in comparison of sort of central and Tidewater Virginia, there's not a lot of black people living out there in the 1860s. And nevertheless, the Bureau did not provide welfare to the idle. Word came in July 1865 that General Howard directed that hereafter no destitute rations be issued to any able-bodied man unless he has a family of his own, and in such cases he must provide undoubted evidence of their destitution, and that he cannot procure any sort of employment, which was underlined, by which to support or partially support, also underlined, them. In Slabtown, the Freedmen's community at Yorktown, during the summer of 1865, the Bureau agents stopped rations to 21-year-old Fanny Brown and her 2-year-old daughter Ann because Fanny, as he wrote, wouldn't work. In October 1866, Nelson Irwin wrote to Major General John M. Schofield, the head of the Potomac Military District, "We gave to the rich white man our best years, our strength, our youth, our sweat, and now that we are free, we get in return meanness, tyranny, and injustice. And now, General, instruct the officers of the Bureau and let them insist on justice. Some of our men are in such a state of perpetual terror. If you turn your backs on us, who can we appeal to?" Unfortunately, as often was the case in the aftermath of the 4 years of the war, blacks, in this case Irwin's, appeal fell on mostly deaf ears. you don't know, General Schofield is not a radical Republican in favor of freed people. The Freedmen's Bureau, as helpful as it was at times and as difficult at others, was in the minds of black residents throughout the South their only hope for equal treatment and justice. Yet the agency found its alliance with the radical Republicans and not with conservative Republicans, Democrats, and they were often at odds with the post-war presidents. By 1870, the Bureau was weaker than ever. On June 30th, 1872, the Freedmen's Bureau was abolished, and thus the agency finally came to an end. And the people that I've elected to show in this slide collectively represent that Reconstruction did not live up to the hopes of many black and some white people. New battles were to be fought. In order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, as stated in the American Constitution. And that fight, of course, continues into the present. Thanks so much, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
There's a question over here. Thank you. I have two questions, really.
Okay.
Could you briefly comment on the folks who were former slaves and elected to stay on plantations, how their lives may have been better and or different, let's say, hopefully better. And then the second question, was concerned when you were talking about President Johnson going back and forth with Congress and this battle to try to benefit the black people who were free and so forth. And you said his own racism interfered with him doing the right thing. I was surprised to hear that after he had been Abraham Lincoln's vice president and so forth. But, you know, I know that they're, you know, a politician is a politician. My question is, what evidence, perhaps in his own writings or whatever, did you uncover that would indicate that he was indeed a racist?
Okay. I'll go in reverse order. Johnson, in his sort of address to Congress, sort of State of the Union, in the late 1860s, will sort of routinely come back to the topic of if we, Congress, the federal government, support or aid in the support of these recently freed people, that they will become lazy and that they won't work and they won't take care of themselves, which, you know, certain segments of the American population still believe in 2015. So Andrew Johnson would find a few friends. And these were published government records. You can look them up on the internet, and you can sort of get an insight into Johnson's political ideology shaped by his upbringing. Some of you know he was not born into a wealthy family. He had, you know, sort of a hard-scrabble life. Then by certainly the 1850s, he had turned a corner with his political life. At that point, he's a slave owner. And I think the sort of best analysis at this point of Johnson and the Bureau is by Andrew Slapp. And he has a not too terribly long book about Andrew Johnson and the Bureau and Reconstruction largely broadly. And on the first question about freed people's new life in the aftermath of slavery, for those people who stayed on, as I mentioned, the Bureau's objective was to get as many hired on contract as possible. Creating contracts was a complex issue because, as I mentioned at the very beginning, there are not a lot of agents, and then there's just slightly more military presence in large pockets of the South where there's, you may have to go 3 counties over to get to your bureau agent if you have a problem with your contract or with the employer. And so it's difficult for the freed person to sort of challenge what's in the contract as Congress sort of tightens in with the money as time goes on, certainly by 1870. So free people are in some ways sort of left to figure out for themselves the best way that they can negotiate with their former owner if they stayed on, or if they moved to somebody else's property to negotiate with that person. In sort of immediate 6 months or so after the war, you see a lot of people trying to leave the agricultural life and go to cities where they think that there are better economic opportunities. And then southern cities start issuing orders upheld by the Freedmen's Bureau. No, you cannot come here to Richmond and Petersburg and Norfolk. You have to go somewhere else, back out into the countryside and find work under contract with either your former owner or employer or someone new.
Question over here.
Yes, I was wanted to understand the organizational structure of the Freedmen's Bureau. Was there offices in each county, in each state? Was it by congressional districts? Was there any tie to the congressional delegation, for example?
So no. Each state is divided up into what were called sub-districts, and you would have at the head is Oliver Otis Howard. Then there would be sort of a second-tier administrative level and the commissioners, and then you would have these sub-district commissioners. And each state's divided up differently, and typically what you'll have is a bureau agent, especially as time goes on, more likely to be located in a city than in a county. So if you live 20 miles away from Petersburg, as some people in my county, then what do you do? And you have a dispute, and the Klan rode through your employer's farm, it's going to take you pretty much all day just to get to Petersburg. And then you've got to arrange a meeting with that person. Then they've got to see if they can do something to assist you or not. So it becomes increasingly more difficult for the bureau agents to enforce federal law and to enforce the community or state's laws as they were with the end of slavery.
Emmanuel, one of the themes that the Park Service really tried to underscore during the sesquicentennial was civil rights, or civil war to civil rights. And as we've been following events 150 years ago, it seems like now would be the time to begin conversations about Reconstruction, the Freedmen's Bureau. Do you know of plans to continue that conversation forward? Are you optimistic that that conversation will happen?
Yes, we're working at the NPS level on a Reconstruction theme study right now, and I got asked to be the Virginia person because it's really the NPS is organized differently than the geography of the country, in the same way I'm saying the Freedmen's Bureau isn't tied to congressional representation or division. So Virginia is in the northeast region of the National Park Service, even though geographically we're in the southeast region of the United States. So the person in the southeast region of the NPS wanted, of course, to include Virginia, and asked me if I would sort of help to gather places, NPS and non-NPS, that would represent ways in which to talk about Reconstruction. So the NPS certainly is working on that, and on the civil rights issue we're actually meeting at the end of this month to sort of brainstorm where we go next with that.
Excellent. So certainly as people have been kind of winding down the Civil War with the sesquicentennial and Appomattox and Bennett Place and so forth, I think it's important to note that the conversation does continue. Mm-hmm. So ladies and gentlemen, Emmanuel Dabney.
The Civil War